Hello, everyone. David here. Welcome back to the DGR podcast. I hope you're all doing well. This is episode number 84, which is cool. I am trying to think of something that we could do for episode 100 of the podcast. I spoke to Kira about it, and we have no idea, but we should mark it in some way. So if you have any ideas, please let us know what you think we should do. I don't know. I thought like a live podcast, but then I was like, is that a bit lame? Will anyone show up? What makes that better than anything else? Like some kind of a giveaway, but like, how do you even run that? I don't know. So let me know what you think. I could use your hand on that. It would be nice to mark it. Or we just say, welcome back. It's episode 100 and we made it. So open to any thoughts on that end. It is a very nice summer's day here in Ireland, which has been very rare this summer. I just had a nice toasted sandwich for lunch. So some ham and cheese, a little bit of mayo, and some tomato into the George Foreman. Before I met Kira, I always underdid my cheese. So now I can truly appreciate, well, now, like for the last 10 years, I can truly appreciate a toasted sandwich as it should be, which is just like 7 blocks of cheese just dripping out the side. And yes, it is much unhealthier, but it is very tasty. Funnily enough, I would never buy a toasted ham and cheese sandwich in a cafe or a deli or anything like that. I would always go for chicken, because I feel like when you go into a cafe, I was just thinking about this the other day, I'd always get chicken. Kira was here and Dinny was here. We were doing some filming and Kira went to get us sandwiches and we had a conversation and I went with the Cajun chicken sandwich. And I feel like some cafes will screw you. They'll put in like this half a slice of ham and you end up with nothing, only bread. But with chicken, it's harder for them to screw you because they kind of the sandwich looks a bit like puffy. It has to be bulkier, and they have to kind of fill it into the corners a bit. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. I'm going to do a solo pod today. I'm just going to answer between 1 and 2 questions nice and quickly. And we'll see how we go. So one question was kind of a question. Yeah, it was a question, but it was a conversation I had with someone. And it was with reference to the podcast that I did with Alan Murdoch, which was episode 82, 2 episodes ago. And also with regards to Jonas's episode, which I don't have the Speedworks episode. Sorry, there's the ham and cheese coming back up now, which maybe was a bad idea. Jonas's episode as well, because the person asked around switching, projection, and reactivity, which we spoke about in those 2 episodes. So I would highly recommend checking those 2 episodes out and those 2 people out. 2 very, very smart, good coaches or great coaches. And the episode will be a good place to start. So switching, projection, and reactivity. And the question kind of started with like, what or which do you think is most lacking in the majority of people's rehab / gym work? So that's where it kind of started. And then the second part, oh no. That was the question. I don't have the second part down, but yeah, it was kind of a conversation. The whole kind of thing was around like, so also give me an example of some exercises of this and blah, 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 blah. So switching, projection, reactivity, which do you think is the most lacking in the majority of people's rehab / gym work? And I would say most people, like traditionally what you see from most people's gym work, it's all lacking usually, and kind of for good reason, because those 3 things are more present. Obviously, they're words to describe what Jonas used to describe, and Alan as well, obviously, good running, good sprinting, let's say. So it boils down to those 3 things, and then you can break them down much further. So they're all lacking, and for good reason, because if you're doing rehab, maybe you're not sprinting at the moment. So like you're missing out on all of those three things, and you're sprinting. Maybe you're not even running, but maybe you're doing your gym work. So that's where the conversation kind of led us down into. And it was around, okay, like how could you train a bit of that work, or do people already train a bit of that work in traditional rehab or strength training? And I would say some of it. So if you think of the reactivity portion of it, yes, people are training a bit of that with regards to plyometrics. Now, traditionally, they're doing a lot of like box jumps and stick the landings and stuff like that. So there's not much or any reactivity there, but that is getting better. Now, not traditionally isn't even the right word, because like there's a lot of people from years and years and years ago doing amazing plyometric work, but I mean traditionally, like what you traditionally see in people's gym work is that's their idea of plyometrics, which aren't really plyometrics, and there is no reactivity involved there. There's no landing and takeoff coupled together, so the energy isn't being coupled together. So reactivity is missing. Projection, I would say, is trained a little bit. Now, not necessarily always horizontally, maybe more vertically, which you're still training a bit of that. So you will see people doing box jumps. Again, let's take that for an example. Like there is some amount of projection there, obviously not, again, horizontally. But they do some projection work horizontally as well. Again, it's not the same as sprinting, but that's not what the question was. So yeah, you'll see broad jumps. You'll see actually where I think people train this stuff. This projection is medicine ball throws. That's where they'll be like aggressive and like push forward and extend a lot of things, or throw the ball overhead, or throw the ball forwards in front, or different things like that. So I think there is some kind of idea or emphasis placed on projection. There is some placed on reactivity in terms of some plyometrics, or at least people are trying to do that, but are usually doing it quite poorly. And then the other one is switching. So which is most lacking? I would say the switching is lacking, because if you look at and I'll probably do a reel or something and put up some videos, but if you look at people's idea of working their hips in the gym, let's take a squat, for example. There's a back squat, there's a front squat, there's all these squats where your 2 feet are underneath you and the feet are glued to the ground and your body is going up and down. Then there's split squats and all this stuff where there is 1 foot in front and 1 foot behind. And yeah, then for the second set, I put my other foot in front and my other foot behind. There's never really an emphasis on the back foot becoming the front foot, and certainly not. Yes, people do walking lunges and stuff like that, but you will always have 1 foot on the ground when that's happening, and there's never like both feet in the air at the same time, and the back leg is becoming the front leg and the front leg is becoming the back leg, that type of thing. So I would say switching is massively underutilized, undervalued, just underappreciated. Not even doesn't even cross people's minds, this switching type of thing. And you see me doing wall work. You'll see people doing wall work where, like, yeah, my hands are against the wall. I'm standing up. I do that hinge to hip lock or bent to straight knee calf raise, as you see in the foot program. Plug for that. And yeah, the left foot is on the ground, the right foot goes back behind me, and then the right foot drives up in front. Like, there is some kind of switching there where the right foot has gone, right knee or the right hip, the right leg has gone from being the one in front up in flexion to being behind as a hinge back. But the left foot is staying in place. If the left foot isn't moving, yes, like I'm going from a bent knee position in the left. If it's a bent to straight knee calf raise that I'm describing, yes, I'm going from this bent knee position to this straight knee position. I'm going from this max propulsive position into this late stance position on the left leg, the stance leg. I'm going from a heel close to the floor to a heel high up off the floor. But the left leg has never actually moved. The right leg is the thing that's moving. So yeah, the right leg is going behind and in front, but the left leg is kind of staying still in place. So that trains like switching a little bit, but also the left leg is pretty stationary there. So also doesn't really train it. You can, you don't have to be, and I think the reason that people don't train the switching in the gym is one, they don't understand it, because, which is strange, because anyone who goes gymming for a while, they go, and even if they do fast stuff like they do plyos where they're bouncing really heavy and hard, they're doing medicine ball throws, they're doing heavy lifting, they're doing 3D work like Copenhagen's and different lunges and stuff like that, you will still go and play basketball or soccer or whatever sport with your friends, and you wake up the next day and your obliques are very sore and your hip flexors and your groins are very sore, and it's because how they control the switching of the hips, the co-contraction around the hips, and yeah, that pulling the back leg to being the front leg and vice versa, that kind of, obviously at speed as well. So like that switching can make you very, very sore and is not something that's trained. And it's not, I don't think it's quite reductionist to think that you can just train that by saying, oh, like, okay, I'm going to do a Copenhagen, I'm going to do a hip flexor drill, I'm going to do a lateral hip drill, I'm going to do an oblique drill. It's not the same, obviously, as like as both hips switching. So that, I would say, out of the three is the least trained, and that's the thing that's locking people up probably the most in the gym as well. They're like, they lose their mobility, and their, particularly a better word to describe this is fluidity, rhythm and fluidity, because they stop ever switching their hips in the gym. And yes, you can say, yeah, well, they walk out of the gym and there's some switching going on there, but the stimulus that people get in the gym is quite strong, and the nervous system kind of remembers that, I think. And obviously you start to look at powerlifters, like they just don't really switch their hips particularly well. When they go and do anything, they kind of shuffle from side to side. So I would say switching is missing. And some examples of what you can use to train that. So if you think of a lunge jump, so you're jumping and sinking down, and you're switching your hips obviously in the air each time. That would be an example of like a yielding type of motion where you're doing that. You could do, so that's like you're switching nice and deep there. You could also do one where you combine this reactivity. That's one of the other third of the three pieces of the puzzle. So I'm actually switching in like a small split stance. I call this a split stance alternating pogo. So you have one foot in front, one foot behind, and you're switching, and you're being super reactive off the ground there. So that's where you would combine a bit of switching and a bit of reactivity. There is obviously less of a switch there. It's a small switch versus the lunge jump. It's a deep switch. What else could we use for switching? You can also use like, if you stand, you have a box in front of you, not that high, maybe up to your knee height or slightly above it. You put your right foot up on the box. And my left foot is on the floor. I push and then I switch so that my left foot ends up on the box. So like I jump up into the air. Left foot ends up on the box, right foot on the floor, and I keep switching. So you'll start to see that would be where one leg is landing high up in flexion and one leg is landing in a lot of extension. You can do a small box, a low box version of that, because that one wouldn't be particularly reactive. It's much more like of a strong muscular push. A small version of that would be like, I have a very low box and I quickly like switch. My right foot taps the box, my left foot taps, and I go as fast as I can, tap, 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 tap. That's a smaller switch there again. But again, much more reactive there. So you could do bounding type of patterns in the gym, or marching patterns in the gym, where you're hop bound patterns where you're hitting right, left. Like this is some nice switching there. So there's a million things that you could do, but I would just say that switching is the thing that's probably missing the most, and is the lack of that is probably the reason why so many people, not just that, but the lack of that is a big part of the reason that so many people, after a while of being injured with a knee injury or an ankle or whatever the hell it is, they go back and they end up hurting their groin again. Not just because they didn't do groin work, but because they actually never switched their hips, which there's so much groin work there. A lot of people get lateral knee pain and hip flexor issues and all this stuff, you need to be switching your hips in the gym, where one foot is forward, one foot is back. That ultimately is locomotion. And yes, it's fine to not train that stuff, that switching in the gym, if you're sprinting and playing your sport as well. But if you're not sprinting and playing your sport at the moment, then you definitely need to find a way to get some kind of switching work into your gym work, or you will end up paying the price, I think. So hopefully that answer was okay. And then second, potentially last question. This was the one with the two parts, even though the other one was just like a conversation more so that we both decided might be helpful to answer on the podcast or to speak about on the podcast. So this was, why do you use slouching exercises? And is that not just promoting a rectus strategy? And then the second part, and secondly, does the slouch teach people to better use their hips instead of using their back? Okay. So why do you use slouching exercises? And is that not just promoting a rectus strategy? I'm going to try and, I'm not sure how much detail to go into in here. Obviously, you're on listening to the podcast to listen for detail, but there's also concepts that you kind of should understand, or it would be helpful to understand. And it's going to be some of it is like visually it's helpful to see videos and stuff. So why do you use slouching exercise, and is that not just promoting a rectus strategy? I guess I should start with saying, giving a little bit of a background into what this person means when they say rectus strategy. So that's kind of a term that I don't really like to use, because I just don't love that term. Not that it's not semi-accurate to what's happening, but when people talk about rectus strategy, they're usually talking about breathing. And when a lot of people do breathing drills, especially from like the PRI world, the emphasis in the breathing work is to mobilize the ribs, or one of the emphases is on mobilizing the ribs. And usually in the PRI world, it's about getting the rib cage to depress and retract. So they want the rib cage to come down and back. Down and back, so that like the front of the rib cage, not that the front of the rib cage closes, even though that is what they're doing, even if that's not the intention behind it. It's to depress the ribs down and kind of pull them back oftentimes by reaching the arms forward. And what that in theory does is open up the back of the rib cage so that they can get some expansion back there. And then what the rectus strategy would then describe is that they're using their rectus abdominis, their six-pack muscle, to like crunch and pull the rib cage down at the front. And that is potentially not such a good option if you're trying to restore expansion. If you're trying to open up a rib cage, like just restore expansion A to P, so back and front, then if you crunch down like that, that's a very compressive feeling. I'll get you to feel it even there, even if you're sitting or standing, just kind of crunch, using your abs to crunch down, and then trying to take an inhale there, and you'll actually feel super restricted. And a lot of the PRI people are using that on purpose to make you feel restricted at the front to find space at the back. But I wouldn't think that is always a good option, or often not. Not that it couldn't be a good option, but a lot of the time it's not a good option, because actually what you want is the air to go A to P. You want it to go front to back a lot of the time. So fill up your back and your front rather than just doing a big rib flare. So I think they overcorrect this like rib flare or a lot of extension in some people by squeezing and crunching people down. So they overcorrect. So the question, hopefully that explains what a rectus strategy is, which is just like a crunch through the six-pack. Guys, if you're sick of using calf and tibialis raises with yourself or your clients, hoping that they will work, secretly knowing that they won't, then check out our foot program in the show notes. I'll teach you how I rehab and train all of my clients, how to unlock their rear foot and their ankle how to pressurize their midfoot, how to load and strengthen their forefoot, how to build a connection from the foot to the hip, how to progress through plyometrics. It will open up so many tools in your toolbox and completely transform how you view lower leg training. So check it out. You won't regret it. So the question was like, why do you use slouching exercises? And is that not just promoting erectus strategy, which I don't tend to use too much of erectus, like where we're trying to pull people down, even though I do use it with some people. And is that not just promoting erectus strategy? I would say no, it's not. And this was where what does frustrate me, because some people see that type of movement. If they just see someone sternum down or their ribs depressed, they automatically say, oh, they're just using their rectus. It's a rectus strategy. Not necessarily. I'll get you to feel this as well. So if you sit up tall or stand up tall or whatever, and you crunch like we did before, so you just crunch your ribs down, depress and retract your ribs, pull them back, and really squeeze your rectus. That's like, you could say that that's a rectus strategy. But now, if you don't do that, you just actually slouch. You just let go. You're not trying to use concentric muscle activity to pull yourself down. You're just going to go 1, 2, 3, and slouch. Now, if you push your abs, you'll feel that they're actually quite soft, versus crunching down one more time, abs hard. Even if you have a bit of flab over them, like me, there's still some ab in there somewhere. And this time you just actually let it go and slouch. Now the abs are soft. So just because the sternum is coming down doesn't mean that you're using a rectus strategy. And now if you want to try it where you crunch down and take an inhale, you'll feel quite restricted, versus slouch down and just take an inhale. You'll feel that you actually have space. So slouching isn't necessarily, certainly not the way I teach it, is not a rectus strategy. We're letting go rather than pulling ourselves down. I think that's a key difference. So that's kind of answers the part of, is that not just promoting a rectus strategy? The answer is no. And then the second part, well, there's 3 parts, but the other part is, why do you use slouching exercises? So you might use a slouching exercise or a sloucher just seated or something like that, just to help someone relax and let go, who always sits up straight or always thinks they need to sit up straight or stand up straight. You might use it in a split squat where you slouch down a bit. You might use it in several different variations, several different options. So you might use it in a breathing drill where you slouch and then you breathe from there to stop them extending and to stop them like flaring their ribs when they inhale all of the time, so that you do get some expansion in the back, but not actually closing off the front that much. You just let go. So that's why you might use a slouching option there. And then the second part of that is, does the slouch teach people to better use their hips instead of their back? Potentially. So if you slouch someone a bit in a split squat, so you're going to do a split squat, and like every time they go to push up from the floor, actually what they do is just extend their back. They pull up instead. Deadlifts, they pull up. Squats, they pull up. Every single thing that they do, they just extend their back a shit ton rather than using their hip. So what you can do is slouch them, and now that takes away, it does take away their opportunity to use their back if they stay slouched. But does it teach them, the second part, does it teach people to better use their hips instead of their back? I would say kind of no is the answer there, because it's again an overcorrection. So if I slouch someone, they are accessing, let's say we're doing a split squat and you slouch them into a split squat. They are accessing hip flexion. So yes, they are flexing their hip as they sit down. But because they slouch, the pelvis is kind of going to be orientated like into, it's going to be a posterior orientation, not really like a nice clean posterior tilt that they've done actively through some muscles that you might want to train. by slouching, their pelvis just gets, their lower back, their lumbar, hopefully actually just kind of flexes, and the pelvis just gets pushed under. And that's actually, that kind of tucking is more of an extension of the hip. So they never actually, so their hip flexion is occurring with lumbar flexion. Let's just forget about what I'm saying about extension of the hip. But as they sit down, if you're slouched, their hip flexion is occurring with lumbar flexion. So they're slouching and they're rounding their back as they sit down. If you measured someone's hip on the table, you would, let's say you wanted to measure someone's hip flexion, you started to bring their knee up towards their chest, you would stop that test. Hopefully, if you're a good clinician and not trying to trick your clients, you would stop that test when their pelvis starts to move or when their back starts to round, which it will for everyone at a certain point, because you just want to measure where can you go when your hip goes. Now, you can keep pushing the test and their back will still round, and that is another measurement. It's not a bad measurement, but you need to understand that now I'm measuring how much their lumbar can flex, really. So when you're doing your table test, you're really looking for you're measuring for relative motion. So hip flexion, how much hip flexion can you get before anything else moves? So if that's how we measure hip flexion, that's also how we restore hip flexion, is how much flexion can you get through your hip without everything else flexing as well. But if you slouch someone, they are getting into hip flexion along with a shit ton of lumbar flexion. And then they are getting into hip extension as they come up. And if you stay slouched, they're getting some active hip extension there, or they are getting some active hip extension, definitely. But you're not. So you've two options then as they come up from a split squat, like unslouch them or stay slouched. So you're going to get some active hip extension, but really how muscles work is that they lengthen before they contract. Even in the air sometimes, or even in the air, like even at high speeds of sprinting, the hamstrings, like that leg swings out in front, the hamstring experiences a bit of length, and then it's like an isometric grabbing. I think, at least, we're not sure, but I think that's probably what's happening. So muscles experience length before they contract. So if you slouch someone, go down into a split squat, you're not really getting much length through the glute max because you have flexed the lumbar spine so much. And so if you slouch them and you sit them down, because the glute max isn't the thing that's being lengthened and loaded, then that's not really the thing that's going to push you back out of there again. So it doesn't really have much leverage to push you back out of there. So what I would say is, like, does the slouch teach people to better use their hips instead of their back? Kind of, but I would say what it teaches more so is better use their foot instead of their back. So remember I said earlier, when you're doing a deadlift, you'll see people, like, a lot of the time pulling up with their back, but you'll hear a lot of different coaches talk about how the deadlift is a push, not a pull. You need to push down with your feet rather than pull up with your back. Obviously, there's a bit of both going on, but the emphasis would be on pushing through the floor. Same with all your exercises, to be honest. And for the people who extend up through their back, they don't push through the floor that well. They're not, if you look at them, they won't be active through their feet, their calves. They're definitely not their hips or anything like that. They're pulling up with their back. So I would say a slouch exercise doesn't teach people to use their hips particularly well at all, but it does teach people to use their foot. If you are a member on DGR Interactive, there's a layer that I go a good layer deeper on this, which you should watch the video. I think it's like 10 or 15 minutes long. And it's called, and again, yes, this is a plug, but like, it's an honest plug, which is like, this is a helpful video for you. So it's a video called Internal Rotation is a Downforce. So internal rotation is how we push through the floor. And if you come to a workshop as well, you will see me discussing common compensations for internal rotation or a lack of internal rotation. Now, I don't just use the word compensation. I also use the word amplification. So it's about getting more if you need more, which you'll see a lot of great athletes do. but it's also about getting some if you have none. So you can compensate, or you can just amplify your strategy way more. Neither is good or bad, it just is. That's important to note. So if you slouch someone, if you're someone who always extends through your back, you don't push through the floor. I just said internal rotation is a downforce. I'm not going to explain that too much because it just would lead me down another track, and it's probably a full other episode, even though I spoke about it before, I think, on this podcast. But pushing through the floor, we use internal rotation. So if you can't push through the floor very well, you have to find another way. So you will extend your back, often like a big anterior tilt, a big back extension. That's how you will overcome muscle slack and push through the floor. That's how you'll get to the front of your feet towards max propulsion. That's what you will do. You will use your back for everything. So that's like, you could see that as a common compensation for lacking internal rotation. You do see that, but again, compensation doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. So, and again, hopefully you're staying with me now. So if you're someone that extends your back for everything, you're trying to find a way to push through the floor. I explained this much better in workshops and online on DJR. You're trying to find a way to push through the floor. You're trying to find a way to overcome muscle slack. You're trying to find a way to get to the fronts of your feet, and like your toes will start to grip. All these things will happen with back extension. So there's another way of pushing through the floor, which is actually pushing your foot through the floor. So if we slouch someone down, what we're doing is taking away their back extension and forcing them now to push through the floor. So a slouching exercise will not restore hip internal rotation, because you need to, if you want to restore hip internal rotation, you need to open up the posterior capsule of the hip and the glute max. So you need to get a big stretch through that area. Not always, depending on the case, but a lot of the time that's what you need to do. So a slouch, as we spoke about a little bit earlier, won't help you do that, because actually you're flexing from your lumbar spine a lot more than your hip, and you're not really flexing and opening up the hip. So it won't help you restore hip internal rotation, but it will help you teach you how to push through the floor, which again, in our workshops, we have a clear differentiation between learning to find your internal rotation and then learning to use it. Finding it is like loading and opening up certain areas, accessing hip internal rotation, knee internal rotation, and pronation. And then from there, you're going to push. So a slouching exercise helps someone not compensate to use their internal rotation all of the time. I'm talking about now a slouch, not just a seated slouch, a breathing exercise, but a slouch in a split squat or something like that. So it helps to take away their back extension, which they use as a compensation to find internal rotation. And now they have to push through the floor. And that's how and now we've taught them another way to use their internal rotation instead of always just extending. So it still doesn't usually teach people, it doesn't usually restore internal rotation, and it doesn't teach people to use their hips particularly well, but it does teach people how to push. That's why you see me use a kickstand hinge, and that's why in the kickstand hinge, you'll feel like your glutes are being torn apart and loaded incredibly, just disgustingly. If you've tried hinges like the way I describe and you can't feel it, it's because you're not doing it right, and you need some coaching from someone that knows what they're doing. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but like, don't say it doesn't work. It's just that you genuinely just aren't in the right position. That's all. We also have a full chapter on that on DJR Interactive. So the kickstand hinge actually teaches really clean hip flexion and hip extension, which helps you to restore your internal rotation potentially at your hip flexion, and your hip extension. And it can also be used to teach you to push through the floor. But in a slouching exercise, in general, people will feel their foot working very hard and their soleus working really, really, really hard. In a kickstand hinge, you'll feel your glute muscles being torn apart. They're two very different exercises with different intentions behind them. So to go back to the original question, why do you use slouching exercises? If it's a breathing exercise, I might use a slouch as a passive way to get the ribs to kind of depress and retract a little bit and breathe there, although I don't do that very often at all. I don't think it's a great option, but it is a really good option for a specific type of person. But you shouldn't be using a slouch in your breathing work very often. You should just have it in your toolkit, but really don't use it that often. And then, is that not just promoting a rectus strategy? No, because it's a passive slouch. It's not an active crunch. So if you look at usually like what PRI are doing, that's a much more active rectus strategy. And I don't think that works particularly well. But again, it can work for some people. And then secondly, does the slouch people to better use their hips instead of their back? Not really. It teaches people to use their foot instead of their back, but it doesn't teach people to use their hips. So this is why a slouch is a very short-term solution where you're just taking away their back. You're just giving them no choice. You know, you're not allowed to use that anymore. You're slouched. You can't use your back extension. It just takes that away and forces them to push through the floor. But it's not a great long-term option because you don't want to be teaching someone all the time, oh, don't use your back. Not that you don't want to work with your back. I mean, like, you want to be making sure your hip is the thing that's working and your back is with that. Not that your back should be chilled or off completely. Don't twist my words. Some fucker listening will try and twist my words, so don't do that. It's just that you want a really active hip extension. So does the slouch teach people to better use their hips instead of their back? No, you don't want to be slouching people forever or for a long time or much at all, a little bit, because not that slouching is bad, but because you actually want to teach people to use their hips. And you don't want to always be like, okay, stop extending your back. The only way for me to stop you extending your back is to slouch you. No, the real long-term residual answer, which just sticks around and actually people learn from, is I don't need to slouch to stop using my back. I just use my hips well instead. That's the answer. That is the residual answer. Teach people to use their hips really well. So now I don't need to slouch. My back, I'm upright. I'm not using my back for absolutely every single thing. So, yeah. So, yeah, I hope that makes sense. I think that conversation that we just had is really important. But I know that some people might be confused. You might want to go back and listen again. You might want to never, ever listen to me talking again, which is also fine. But what I'm saying is important. And I am also not wrong about this. So, so if you feel like I'm wrong, that's fine. But don't just say I'm wrong because you're confused. My goal is not to confuse you ever, but it's also not to baby you. But I am not wrong about this. Maybe I'm wrong, but probably not wrong. The odds are looking likely that I'm right about what the stuff that I just said. So if you're confused, you're almost confronted with something now, which is either I'm going to say, fuck this, David's wrong because I don't understand it, or, okay, I don't understand this, I'm a bit confused, but that just means it's an opportunity to go a bit deeper and learn. Not necessarily from me or whatever, I don't care, but like, don't just put up a guard now because I confused you and say, this is bullshit, he's wrong. I'm not fucking wrong. More than likely, I'm not wrong here. The odds are in my favor that what I'm saying is actually has a lot of validity. You just don't understand it yet. Some of you. Okay, I don't mean that in an arrogant way. I just mean stay curious. Don't just close your mind off if you're confused. Confusion is good. It means like you're working through something. If every single thing you listen to and everyone you talk to, you're just like, yeah, I got it, I agree with that, that's not challenging you. Okay, so yeah, I think that's the podcast. I hope it was helpful. And let me know, please. Actually, that would be really good if you let me know. I'll probably do like a reel on the switching stuff. I'll put it up on our DGR education page. So make sure you're following that page. I have another page where I post clips from this podcast and I just do other stuff up there from DGR Interactive and stuff like that. So the handle is DGR_education. Yeah. So yeah, Hope that was helpful. Join DJR Interactive. That would be really good if you want to learn more about this stuff and have visual aids and have short breakdowns. But apart from that, that's the pod. Talk to you guys next week.